Keith, take it away.
I wouldn't have minded that little intro for the recording, but it's okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Nyberg. I'm a platform operations consultant with Atumos, and that's how I got to work with Sydney for quite a while prior to her departing and going to work for Hyperspace. But that being said, or Hyper, whatever Hyper company you're at now. That being said, I do run the San Diego Marketo user group. I've been around the industry for quite a while now, so I see a lot of familiar names here on the call today. Per Sydney's comment, please do stop me if there are any questions that you have. I've also had a cup of coffee and I do talk fast, so I'm going to do my best to slow things down and keep them casual. I don't really have any slides today to cover, to be completely honest, which is probably shame on me as a speaker, but I thought I'd pull a classic Edward move and just jump into an instance and start poking around and talking about how to solve problems. So the thing that we were going to talk about today is email frequency. And I can't remember the snazzy little write-up that I gave it, but in general, the problem that I often find with clients and with people that are managing instances is this question around how often they're communicating with their database, right? I've seen a couple different creative solutions that people have tried to implement where they say, okay, well, every time we send an email, we're going to like create a score field and we're going to write a smart campaign to start to stamp that score field every time an email is sent. And to be completely honest, that type of approach is probably not the best, only from an instance performance perspective, right? You think about emails being such a high volume activity that's going to occur. You can literally bring your system to a halt if you target like a good portion of your database, if you have data management running in that capacity. So outside of other tools like a data warehouse where you may be able to extract activity data from Marketo via API and store it externally, there aren't really a lot of options to understand the number of times that you're sending emails to records uniquely in your database, right? So when I was tasked with answering this problem for one of my clients at one point, I started to think about the various approaches that you can use to basically get at that question. And so I'm actually going to share my screen to start off here. Can you see my screen, everybody? If at any point it stops, please let me know. It's happened to me before and people just don't say anything. And that's really not very fun because I'm just talking away and they can't see anything. But so I'm in our instance right now. I think I'm going to start down below on the smart lists to kick us off, because the one approach that I see people do very frequently, which is something that you still have the ability to do, is to kind of create logic like this in your instance, where you'd say, I want to understand the number of emails that I have sent this week to my instance, right? And you'd create a smart list to say somebody was sent an email. I like to include parameters like not contains autoresponder. This does obviously require you to have an instance that has nice email asset naming conventions that you can pull out autoresponders from this count if you want. You don't have to, but important for me, I like to do this just to kind of pull some of the operational emails away, only because those don't, I'm pretty certain they don't count towards your communication limits actually. And so the point is that these really shouldn't be a valid number to include in your standard targeting, because really when I think of how we're communicating to an audience, I would think of emails that we are planned, that are coordinated campaigns that we want to send out, right? And so again, if you wanted to say, how many people have I been emailing this week or this month or whatever, you can go about it in this approach and you can say, okay, who did I send an email to? I want to exclude autoresponders. And then you can use this lovely little minimum number of times constraint to say I've sent them at least one email, right? You could remove this logic and that would show you people who have received more than one, obviously. And this approach you could kind of rev on and you could add other filters and that would start to return people for you, right? And I think that that's like the primary problem with just this simplified smart list approach, is that you're always going to be limited to updating filters to look at volume kind of across the board. Like if you wanted to look at 2 emails and 3, you'd have to come in here and edit it every time. And then you'd have to be kind of like just checking the volumes one off, right? So really the program that I created that I like to work through is just called an email frequency report or program. In there, you're going to create smart lists that are essentially going to align to each of the categories you want to report on. The categories that I chose to use for this align to Marketo's out of box in time frame durations, right? So for the date of activity, there's this in time frame constraint. And then there's all the lovely times and places that you can pick that are nicely, easily grouped. I chose this week, this month, this quarter, because that's more insight into like what's happening right now, real time. And I think the real value of this program is understanding what's happened historically, right? Last week, last quarter, last month. And that's because these numbers, once that week interval has passed, is going to be stationary, right? It's not going to continue to change. It's really going to be an accurate snapshot in time for something that you've historically done, right? The one important thing that I want to call out just before we dig in too much deeper is the data retention policies around Marketo emails as a whole. I think everybody remembers that last year in like July, or I can't remember when it was, August, Marketo changed their retention criteria for email activity, right? And that means an email was sent or an email was delivered as an activity is only retained in Marketo for 90 days. It used to historically be 25 months. So be mindful of that when you're using constraints like in last quarter, because that last quarter volume is actually not going to be accurate because you're likely halfway through this current quarter. And it's going to be like missing half of the last quarter, if that makes sense, because of the 90 days. For those of you that aren't familiar with this, data retention policy article, this is like one thing that I have bookmarked that I reference all the time. These are all the activities, as you can see, that are retained for only a 90-day period of time. And then you have all the other standard activities that are retained for 25 months. And I routinely go into instances where people have a date of activity constraint that is much longer for one of these activities than 90 days. And I chuckle to myself because they just are totally missing the accurate source of truth. So either way, definitely recommend bookmarking that. But back to the program at hand. Really what I like to do is create smart lists, like I mentioned, to kind of align. And so for this week, what I would typically recommend is look at your communication limits. If you're not going to be including, or if you're going to be including operational emails, you could probably go even above your communication limits. And so even though our instance is set to only 2 emails per week, I like to go in and go a little bit higher than that because there will be other operational emails that are not autoresponders that I may want to see in my report, right? And so for this week, I only have 0 all the way up to 5. It is important to call out that in the 0 smart list that I have running, I've actually pulled out non-marketable fields, right? And so for everybody that's familiar with Marketo, there's 4 fields that are going to restrict emails from being sent out to people. Those fields include blocklist, unsubscribe, email invalid, marketing suspend. And so for this filter specifically, I'm saying if I didn't send any emails, I want to make sure that I'm looking at a number that represents people who were actually marketable, but that I still didn't target or send an email to, right? And that's why this smart list includes those additional parameters using all criteria. So you kind of iterate on that and you do it for this week, you do it for this quarter. I like to use these little naming conventions of TW for this week, TQ for this quarter, TM for this month. And you can see the kind of durations of time that I have done in here, right? So for this week, I have 1 up to 5, and they're all single email values for each smart list versus this quarter. I'm kind of grouping them in ranges for 1 to 4, 10 to 14, and you can see it's out of order because the sorting, but 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19. And if you go in here, you'll just see in the smart list that it's really just saying that they received 15 emails in that time period, but they did not receive 20 emails in that time period. And so this would aggregate everybody who received anywhere from 15 up to 19 during that time period. So once you create these reports or these smart lists, which I created centrally in the program, you can create a couple different audience categories. And so in here, I created an instance reports as a folder I created. These are just people performance reports. For those of you that aren't familiar with a people performance report, this is like the standard out-of-box Marketo report that gives you the ability to group records by a specific field. So it's this top one here, the people performance report. And so if I go into the setup here, you're going to notice that people performance reports do give you the ability to create custom columns. If you're not leveraging this, this is fantastic functionality that gives you like close to some of like what RCE would give you with like a table formatting. Obviously, there's way more in RCE. You can't even really compare them. But for the ability to group records by a specific field and then lay over custom columns to look at that field data across other criteria in your instance, this is really incredibly powerful. And so for this last month, as an example, I can group by whatever I want. If you have like an account type field, maybe that's a really great field to group this by. You could go by company name just to see what accounts you're targeting by volume. But this really doesn't matter as much because I'm really more focused on the aggregate volume for the last month, in addition to how that breaks down over the different categories that we group them out into for volume, right? So down here in the custom columns, you're going to see that I just added in the smart lists that align to last month. So all my last month smart lists are in here. For the smart list, this actually has no criteria on it. And that's because this is my instance reports. We're going to jump down into evaluating unique audiences here, but you could always add additional criteria in the smart list here if you wanted to and just have one version. We'll get into this lower stuff down here in a second. But looking at last month, when you actually run this report, again, you're going to group it by whatever fields you'd like. But really what this is going to start to give me insight into is this is my 0. And sorry, this is the total count. And this is my 1 to 3. And this is my 0. So it's hard to see, but it's 0xLM is what it says there. And there's some lovely HTML formatting in the hint text that Marketo gives you. And I can actually open this up too if you want to see it, the 0. But really what this is telling you right now at a high level is that there are a total of 295, there are a total of 295 people in my instance in this workspace right now, right? Of those people that are in here, this is obviously how they break out by customer type. But really I can tell that there are 71 people that I had the ability to market to that I did not send an email to in the last month, right? And then you can go look at the one count and I can say, I emailed 37 people one email in the last month, right? And I can go to 2 and I can say, well, for the 2 people, or sorry, this is 4 to 6 technically. Oh, and it's last month, sorry. So yeah, it's 1 to 3, and then it's 4 to 6, right? And this is a workspace. There's not a lot of actual records in here, and we're not actually running stuff through here, just test records. But really, you can start to see how that would paint a lovely picture for you of your audience by whatever audience you're looking at, kind of the number or the percentage of that number that's receiving a certain number of volume in your instance. And this can get really powerful. So to pause there, I like to create kind of one global instance version of reports that gives me insight into my entire instance up top here, which basically just means there's no smart list filters. And then I like to clone that out and just create a single smart list for audience 1. And then that audience 1 is going to be referenced in all of these reports specific to audience 1, right? Which means that I can just go in and create criteria in one spot, and then I can go look at all of my reports for that specific audience. And I'm going to be able to very quickly analyze any audience. So somebody could say, how are we marketing to our customers right now? I could go in here, I could throw in a customer filter. I could look at the reports and I can immediately report back and say, well, last month we did this quarter we've done this, or this week we've done this, last week, whatever timeframes are enabled in here, right? I think one of the most important things to call out, though, again, is that data retention is always moving, right? And when I say that, I mean, these reports are obviously not always going to retain the data that you've had. And if you really want to understand like your run rate over time, it's probably best just to create a spreadsheet and come in here once a month and just look at last month as an example and just start to jot down the numbers for last month before that month churns and it's the next month, right? And so that'd be the best way to kind of create a baseline of how often you're, emailing people in your database. For the other approaches that I've seen, I think that this one's the easiest to implement. It doesn't require much time or energy, and it gives you the insights that you need. Again, I think that the data management approach is not as robust just from a system processing perspective, although it would give you the ability to potentially retain that data over time, just depending on how you're managing it. I think the primary questions that I'm typically trying to answer when I'm looking at something like this are both ends of the spectrum, right? Who is in my instance that I'm not communicating with at all and why? And to start to drill into those records and figure out, is it a persona restriction? Are they undesirable for some reason? And start to identify whether or not these records should truly be like marketing suspended or have some other system flag put in place to show that we don't want to be marketing to them. So that's one end of the question, right? Who am I not targeting that I should be? Because there could be really big gaps in your nurture strategy you're targeting. And this will help you basically find that volume and figure out how to correct it, right? The second end of that is, who am I over communicating to, right? I think that I've done this for a couple different clients that are very large enterprise clients, and we've been surprised to see the volume of emails that have been going out to people. And there's always this urge as marketers to say, well, we really want to be communicating. We want to stay in front of people. And then I go talk with like a VP of marketing and say like, hey, like, do you realize that you talked and sent 5 emails to somebody in a week? And they kind of panic and go, well, shit. And I'm like, it was only a few records that were sent that, but that's really the risk that we run without good communication limits in place. That other operational emails that need to go out, I guess we can't always control those. But either way, it's just important to understand what's happening in your instance. And this is kind of an easy way to get at that. So I'm going to stop there. I think that I demoed enough of the program that people get a general understanding of how that's functioning, but I'm happy to jump through any other components that people would like or address any questions related to this.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any question of Keith. I'm gonna stop the recording.